Hi, and welcome back to our study group going through Peter Adamson's A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. I'm Nerdalliun Plebz, and today with me, Rogério Marques and Pong. Welcome back, guys.
Hey there.
Great to be back.
Yeah, today's very exciting. Well, we're closing off, for the time being, our study of Greek philosophy, the history of Greek philosophy, classical Greece, with a discussion of Plato and Aristotle's immediate successors.
Once again, the Nerdy Plebs joins with would-be philosopher and fractal. Okay, so let's try to finish for now the Greeks with a nice finish, a nice polish. So here are our visual aids. I included also a bit that gives us a savor of what was going on when Aristotle mentions Plato, either implicitly or explicitly, just to give a few examples based on the discussion that involved Peter Adamson, McCabe, and Ralph. What was his name? Raphael Wolff. Okay, so amicus Plato said magis amica veritas, which means well, friends are to be cherished, but to be cherished even more is the truth. And so, well, this is truly Aristotle trying to remember himself that he is a philosopher above being a friend. And so one of the examples that I found really interesting was how Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics would address Plato's concept of the form of the good as a mere kind of narrative device for him to show it in opposition or in contrast to his own ideas of goodness. And so set up for what I want to say about function or end, as Aristotle, me putting words in Aristotle's mouth. Someone had to do that as well. So multiplicity of goodness, or irreducible plurality of goodness, in the words of McCabe for the first one, and of Raphael Wolff in the second one. So even current day philosophers name these things differently. And so different things and different beings are good in different ways, according to Aristotle. For instance, a horse is excellent for its speed, while a knife is excellent for the keenness or sharpness of its blade. The end can be inferred from the function of an object, and the function can be inferred from the form. Form fits function. And then particular excellence can be inferred from both the end and the function. Reason is what a specific function is a specific function to humans, telling us apart from other beings. Humans' end, therefore, is to use reason well. And so Aristotle goes and concludes the good life is the result of learning the first one, of having awareness of the first point, and applying the second point to one's life. And this is, and okay, so this is the first example. Go ahead, guys, if you have something to comment or add or even ask.
Yeah, the discussion on Aristotle's reaction to Plato is interesting to me. They among the three of them, McCabe, Peterson, and I forget who the third person was.
Raphael Wolff.
Mr. Wolff. Kind of clarify that Aristotle had a much more complicated relationship with Plato's ideas than just debunking them, as sometimes portrayed. And yeah, so I think in this example, they kind of discuss how Aristotle's view actually looks quite close to some of the stuff written in the Platonic dialogues. So much so that it's maybe a little bit misleading to characterize Aristotle as completely debunking Plato. So less so debunking more than and more refining maybe what Plato said.
Using Plato as a starting point instead of as a boxing bag, maybe one might say.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it.
And then here next we have what seems like a dialectical trick that Aristotle might have learned from Plato. And this I also, when I read the Nicomachean Ethics, I really found this amusing. Aristotle just goes on a tangent, and it's a really burning question that he leaves us with. And he leaves us with the question, he's just, here, take the hot potato. And he just leaves. And we're kind of perplexed, and maybe our mind is racing, even maybe our heart rate is increased. And he justifiably says, well, this is a question, since we are in an ethics class, and we are concerned with the practicality of ethics. This is a bit more related to metaphysics. Maybe on his day, in his classes, he would say, well, if you want to know more about that, you can just attend our metaphysics lessons, or whatever he would call his metaphysics. And the result for the reader is, well, damn, he won't explain this. Now we are left, and the only thing we can do is philosophize, which maybe was the point. He maybe was using this as a technique to kind of prod students to think for themselves. And in contrast to what I experienced in schooling, teachers never did this. Teachers always kind of gave us the answer, and kind of made us, our thinking being molded by what they were kind of telling us. This is the conclusion that these thinkers, whatever they may be, arrived at, and so this is how it is. And if you write this in the test, you will get full score. And so, yeah, to me at least, I don't know about you guys, but to me at least, this contrasts quite intensely with my experience of school up to high school, especially.
Yeah, and here I was thinking that Aristotle was putting it behind a paywall. We're not going to talk about that now, but we'll talk about that at the 10 Drachma Symposium this evening. Tag.
So even they would even have to buy drinks because it's a symposium.
I think Aristotle here is just prefiguring a long and much maligned tradition in mathematics books of saying the proof is left as an exercise to the reader.
Here is a superbly complex IKEA set without any instructions. Good luck.
Yeah. I can't remember where I read it. I think it may have been in a tweet by some professor of something, saying it's, at least in some schools of physics, it's a tradition to intersperse completely impossible problems among the normal homework problems and then not tell the students about them. Just assign a set of homework problems, and in that set, every now and then, there's a problem that's completely not solvable to the students. And then when students complain, they get the explanation, well, if you're going to be doing physics, you never know whether the problem you're working on is just really difficult or impossible. You kind of just fumbling your way forward, you find out for yourself.
You just reminded me of a famous physicist whose name completely escapes me, but he had the bad habit of arriving late at his lectures, and even arriving after the lectures and just copying what was on the blackboard. And so one of these days he arrived so late, he only had an impossible or unsolved problem as of yet on the blackboard. He just assumed it was homework, went home, solve the problem as homework, like it was nothing, and he just solved an impossible problem. I'm not sure if it was of physics or mathematics, but it's so funny. And yeah, and I think they should do that more. They should kind of give newcomers these supposedly impossible or unsolved problems. Who knows? Maybe some of them has kind of like the keys for the problem in their minds by just sheer luck, and they might solve it.
At least Aristotle didn't do it like Fermat and make up an excuse for why he's not talking about it. He's like, this marvelous answer to this, but the answer is too big to fit in the margin here. So unlucky for you.
I honestly imagine Aristotle as a guy who would do some business practices, like Graham alluded to, and in addition to what Graham mentioned, he probably would upsell things, because well, one must finance their exquisite clothing choices and bling and whatnot. So I kind of imagine him doing these kinds of practices, with the disclaimer that this is completely speculation. It's wild speculation, but funny wild speculation. And also in this example here, there is this mention of words. We are apparently using the same word, good. It's a good sailor, a good meal. The same, exact same word, but what we are pointing at in physical reality is actually a sailor that can keep the boat from capsizing, even with agitated waters, and getting to the intended port. While for the meal, we are mentioning a meal that has balanced seasoning, isn't overcooked or undercooked, and tastes pleasantly. It's pleasant to the senses. Completely different things, only for these two examples, and we use exactly the same word: a good sailor and a good meal, which is perplexing, if we think about how we are using language, and maybe making ourselves confused or deluded by this use of language of homonym words. But also there is a point here, which is maybe there is some point here for reconciling Plato's monism of the good with Aristotle's multiplicity of goodness, which is the only, in this quote of Peter Adamson, the only thing that a good horse has in common with a good knife is that just as a knife cuts well, a horse runs well, or does whatever horses are supposed to do. Completely referencing Aristotle's use of the same examples that Plato also used in his Republic. And so maybe he did it intentionally, or he was lazy at getting examples, but probably was intentional because he assumed the Republic of Plato was an essential reading material for his students. And so goodness or excellence maybe actually means actualization of a potential, and the potential is a thing that can vary between things. This was kind of me trying to bridge the gaps. I'm curious to know what you guys think.
Yeah, Graham, you want to weigh in first?
Yeah, I was going to say, how do I want to approach this one? I think part of the issue is, for me, is the idea of goodness is a value judgment. And it's something that's going to come from your perspective, because the same, sort of like the idea of one man's trash is another man's treasure. The idea of good is going to be based in the individual perspective rather than rather than something inherently with the object itself. And that's where I have an issue with that idea of even that form of goodness is, Plato tried to take it as an abstract, which is inherent within the object itself, and I don't see that the concept of good as being within the object itself. I'm
Okay,
just
fair
going to
point.
tag on that.
Fair point. May I pose a follow-up question? So, if you're saying that individuals have different criterions of goodness, one man's trash is another man's treasure, fair point. And to address that point, I would say, well, maybe we can also say that different individuals have different potentials. They have a different brain connectome, they have different genotypes and phenotypes, rather actually unique genotype, phenotype, and connectome. Uh, almost by sheer brute force of statistics, impossible to duplicate unless the universe ends and just restarts exactly the same, which is also we don't know if that's the case. But in this particular instance of the universe, there is only one Nerdalliun Plebz. There is only one Pong, exactly like Pong is, and only one Rogério Marques. And even if we compare with different slices of time, this also holds. We are never the same in different slices of time of our entire lives. Having said that, I would ask if it makes sense, if it's reasonable to say that by virtue of our differences in structure, although there are some similarities because the three of us are human beings, we also have some peculiar features that individualize each and every one of us three, making that we each one of us has different potentials that we can actualize if we pursue them. Come on, disagree with me.
It's hard to disagree when you're right. Yeah.
My thinking is a slightly different line of thought. I'm still curious to explore this relationship between Aristotle and Plato. That was what the whole episode was about. And I still see Plato or Aristotle as denying that Plato's conception of forms, such that the good has a form. Sorry, I lost my track of thought with that sentence. I'll start over. I still think Aristotle is contradicting Plato about the good having an abstract form that exists independently of any of these good things, so a good horse and a good knife. Independent of good horses and good knives, there's this abstract object of a form of the good. I think that's Plato's doctrine, and I think Aristotle denies that doctrine. And I may be misunderstanding both Plato and Aristotle. That's what I'm trying to get clear about here. So I think Aristotle moves away from forms as these independent abstract objects a little bit, but only sometimes makes it clear that he's doing that, and at other points when he's doing, say, the metaphysics, or the when he talks about the prime cause of the outermost sphere, he seems to contradict himself on this point. And also when he talks about the intellect as being a materialist form, he talks about form not being independent of matter, not existing independent of matter, but rather just that what inheres in the matter that gives it its essence, that makes it what it is. So intellect for Aristotle is this one thing that has a form, but not matter, or has a formal cause and not matter. So has independent reality of its matter, and no other thing has no other form has this characteristic, and he needs that because he needs the intellect. His theory of the intellect is that it's this thing that can transform, shapeshift, take different forms in any potential form, and because matter has physical limitations, he infers that since the mind can take any form, and matter would have or since the intellect can take any form, and matter does have these physical limitations of the forms it can take, so the intellect must be immaterial, and these outermost spheres are intellects that cause the universe to move. So when he talks about that, he sounds quite similar to Plato, and then in other places, when he clarifies what formal causes are, he sounds like he's quite at odds with Plato. And so in this case, in the form of the good, it reads to me like he's quite at odds with Plato, that there's no immaterial entity that is the form of the good, that when knives partake in this form, they're good, and when horses partake in this form, they're good. Rather, he has this other kind of cause, a teleological cause and their final cause, as we call it, telos, which is the purpose for which knives exist and the purpose for which horses exist. And insomuch as they're actualizing their potential to fulfill their purpose, that's what it means to be good, or what it means for them to be good. And that's different from saying that they partake in the form of the good. But I don't know how different, because that is kind of like this abstract definition of the good. That is, the definition itself is a kind of form, it's a kind of principle that they adhere to. So, I don't know, kind of thinking out loud here.
You just reminded me by your points of the opening scene of 2001 Space Odyssey, when the apes are confronted by the monolith, and all of a sudden one of them picks up a bone and probably starts to have teleological thinking, like using thinking. He acquired a tool of thought, and he associates with the bone this large femur that he picks up. This thing it has an end, which is to smash, and he starts to smash the rest of the skeleton of the beast that the defunct beast that had been killed there. And from then on, human beings supposedly have been picking up bits and pieces of nature, not just repurposing them as they are, like the bone, but also transforming and combining bits and pieces of nature with a purpose in mind. From the bone to basically the space station that the introduction just so jarringly makes the transition from one to the other. It's just like, well, human history is nothing. Just let's go from ape to spacefaring humans, as if it were nothing. What's 300,000 years? If we look at the cosmic perspective, or the what came before, the dinosaurs or whatnot. Yeah, so what I would say is teleological thinking might not be ontologically valid. It might not adequately explain or describe the inner workings of the universe by itself. But when human beings or any other being that has sentience and also has manipulative capacities to repurpose or re-engineer nature is put into the mix, then teleological thinking is but a tool.
I wanted to link back to what Graham said about the seeing value as adhering in objects and seeing value as being subjective. So I think Aristotle is espousing a bit of a relativism here, that value, what it means to be a good horse is relative to the telos of, or what it means for a being to be good is relative to the telos of that being. But he sees the telos as natural, so not given to variation, and also eternal. So horses have always been around, and their telos have always been to be good horses, and it always will be. And it's like, and so whatever your purpose for a horse is kind of irrelevant for what the purpose of a good horse is. And you can also subjectivize telos by saying, no, purposes are things agents have, subjective agents have. So you can have goals, and do things with purposes. You can have intentions because you're an agent, and only agents can have purposes. And then different agents can have different purposes for the same thing. So one person may acquire and raise a horse somehow because they want companionship and they take care of the horse and they like the friendship with the horse. Other person may want to use the horse for competition, so to show off different maneuvers. Another person may want to use the horse for battle. Another person may want to use the horse to drag a cart. One person may want to use the horse to travel just solo on the back of the horse through lands. And so different agents may have different purposes for a horse in the abstract, and then when they're deciding which of the horses is the better horse for them to choose, which is the better horse will be dependent on whatever their purpose for the horse is. So then different people can come to different conclusions about which horse is the best horse based on their individual purposes they have in mind for the horse, which is different, I think, from Aristotle's conception. And I think that's a conception that's close to what Graham was saying about the values being subjective. And I think that's quite foreign for Aristotle and Plato both, to subjectivize value that way. I think they were both objectivist about values. Although it does seem that Aristotle is more relativist and Plato is more universalist, so he thinks there's this unified, universal form of good, and everything that is good is somehow the same in the way that it participates in the form of the good. And he was looking for a definition of the form of the good so that he would know what would be good in every case in which a question like that would come up. And I think he had in mind something like a definition for a circle, a mathematical formal definition for a circle. Once you have the definition for a circle, you can then derive facts from the circle and use that definition in proofs. And so in like steps in your argument, like a mathematician you might say, well, this step holds by definition of a circle. And he wanted to make arguments in ethics and in politics where he could do the same thing. This step in the argument holds by definition of the good, and whatever shape or whatever principle or whatever pattern that definition defines, I think is what he had in mind with the form of the good. And I think Aristotle here is saying, like, well, you're never going to find a definition that really works that way. The closest you're going to get is in this kind of metaphysical thing, describing the four different kinds of causes, describing the difference between a formal cause and a material cause, efficient cause and a final cause, and saying that, well, things that are good because they actualize their potential for final cause. Also, you have to do the metaphysics of actuality and potentiality. But then that definition in and of itself may have actually satisfied Plato for the thing that he wanted, especially if Aristotle could then give a very strong case that these telos themselves are like these eternal abstract principles, so that for forever, everywhere, since forever, horses have had the same telos, and so it always means the same thing to talk about a good horse. You might say everywhere, for everyone, since forever, for always. A city has the same telos, so a good city will always be a city that actualizes the telos, actualizes the potential of fulfilling the telos of the city. And I think both of them would push against me and Graham's notion that purposes are relative to subjects, and different subjects can have different purposes for different things. And so which is a better city may depend on why you're moving to a city. If you move to a city to do a career in the creative arts or in theater, there are some cities that are better for that. Some other cities are better if you're pursuing a family life. You want to raise a family in a safe and safe city with nice educational opportunities and good healthcare and good social security and good safety and whatever. Good for kids and good for your theater career or good for your scientific career, or there are different purposes people may have for a city, and even the same person may have several purposes, and that kind of undermines the possibility of using the form of the good, using an abstract definition of the good as a justification for a step in an argument of ethics, to say, well, we ought to do this in this city because that would make the city better, objectively true, and that's an objective truth that has always been true, will always be true for everyone, forever. So I don't know. I think I was supposed to walk away from this episode thinking that Aristotle is a lot more in agreement with Plato than he's typically portrayed as. And yet I think Aristotle's notion of a formal cause is quite different from Plato's notion of like abstract forms, the ideas. And it only looks much more similar specifically when Aristotle talks about intellects. And I don't quite know what to make of that.
If I may, you mentioned a really interesting example. You mentioned the circle. So the circle, what is a good circle? Or does it even make sense to ask what is a good circle? Because by its very definition, all the perimeter of the circle is at the same distance of its center. And so there you can kind of say, since the circle is by definition actualized, I don't think there is any more potential to actualize there. Well, it is perfect, and by being perfect, we can say it is good, and we can easily say that. We can easily do that because the definition of a circle is clear cut. It's objective, as long as we don't start to talk about different Euclidean space concepts or whatnot. But if we talk about on a blank page of paper, if you draw a circle properly with the proper tool, that its name escapes me right now, you will have a good circle. And if you conceptualize a circle in your mind, you will have a perfect circle, in opposition to the good circle on the paper that probably has error by a few molecules or atoms or whatnot, because the circle was drawn in the real world, where there is always kind of signal and error on whatever we try to measure, and whatever we try to execute. Well, in the realm of metaphysics, it's as if we are gods, de facto gods, and we only relinquish our roles as gods in the realm of metaphysics if we don't think and if we don't conceptualize things or attempts to replicate things that we see with our senses in our mind, and even other things like a perfect circle that we will never see in the real world. And so having said all this, it seems to me that the idea of a form of excellence, of perfection, of the good, is completely confined to metaphysics, to the realm of metaphysics, to concepts, and only in things that are sufficiently simple that we can conceptualize the perfect thing of them, that they are not subject to contingencies. If we are trying to conceptualize in our mind the perfect human being or the perfect city, we might as well try our entire lives to conceptualize such a thing of perfection, and we will fail probably miserably, because it's so subject to many conjectures. The perfect city depends on many things. Is the city coastal or is it inland? Or does the city have many right-leaning persons, left-leaning persons, people that ascribe to one religion, the other religion? Are people there obsessed with hamburgers, or are they, or do they all ride bicycles, or do they go travel by bus, etc., etc.? It's an endless stream of variables to account for, or contingencies. And so although having the form of the good, or having this exercise of thinking about an approximation of the good, or trying to approximate ourselves to the form of, or the conceptualization of excellence, it might be a nice exercise that can yield some fruits in regards to ethics, to politics, if we're talking about the city, but it will never be isomorphically matched with reality. We will never have a match of a concept of perfection, of something that involves human beings because of the complexity. You just need to involve one human being and you have complexity. You cannot compute human, basically. And so I think that the idea of excellence, either by Plato or Aristotle, are interesting as exercises to try to approximate with lower error bars whatever kind of excellence we may attribute to the thing, whatever kind of telos we might attribute to the thing. And of course, it depends on the telos that we attribute to the thing. I hope this made sense.
Well, I followed you. I was going to say, to throw back to Nerdalliun real quick, my take on what Aristotle and the disagreement with Plato, you know, argument comes from the idea is like with this one with the forms. What I see Aristotle doing is taking Aristotle's one size fits all concept of the form and kind of parsing that into different categories. And that's what he's doing with the four causes, where that's where he's basically trying to take away and leave that abstract concept of form left for Plato, and take away everything that he doesn't think really fits into that original concept of form with Plato. And the way I see that Aristotle would be able to adjust to a sort of a relative concept of the telos would be that it was relative to the creator of the object, with the idea that the creator is what's determining the good or bad within the object, not necessarily the user. I think that one would be a bridge too far for Aristotle. And moving on to some of Rogério's ones, it's one of the problems with the idea of good as one of those abstract concepts that you can argue from for morality is you end up with the idea that you can produce logical chains where evil is good. It's like you have good murderers. What's the perfect murder, or that sort of concept, and you end up with a lot of contradictions. And I think that's something that I can't imagine Aristotle didn't see and wanted to avoid. And last is one of my recurring issues that keeps coming up here with the Greek philosophers is they're wrestling with trying how to express a spectrum of things. It's like they have trouble with the concept of becoming, and another one is they have good and perfect, but they don't have better. It's like something is good. You don't have a judgment between two things and saying one is better than the other. That just seems to be missing from the Greek thought here. And I think that is something that if they had, they wouldn't have faced a lot of the problems they did. But since they didn't have it, they used the tools they had available. So you're going to tag on all those points.
Fair points. I hardly can disagree with you, Graham.
Yeah, so I guess what they did make clear to me is that Aristotle definitely was a student of Plato, and many times he'll be writing in addressing arguments that are written in Plato's dialogues, and he might not necessarily explicitly cite the arguments, but for people familiar with Plato's works, it would have been very obvious when he's engaging with Plato's arguments. And it's not always engaging in a manner that's contradicting Plato or putting down Plato. Oftentimes it's a building on top of Plato, or just refining what Plato said, or sometimes just plainly agreeing with Plato. And they do make the point that it was part of Aristotle's method to use in doxa, and we've sort of discussed that a couple of times as well, to use the thought of previous people to find starting points that are promising and to sort of salvage what's correct in previous people's opinions and to mix and match them when people disagree with each other. Aristotle liked to find compromising middle ways between disputing parties. And so I think there's a lot of things written in Plato that Aristotle probably ends up being quite close to. And also there are things where he goes some ways away from Plato towards some middle that's between Plato, or something that we think we attribute to Plato, and something attributed to someone else who contradicted Plato. But yeah, regarding the forms, I'm still not 100% clear what I think about that. I think my thinking will update. But for now I'm sat with that. When discussing the four causes, Aristotle's notion of formal cause is quite different from Plato's notion of forms, and it only looks a bit closer when Aristotle talks about intellect and the divine intellect that moves. That's the prime mover of the universe. And Aristotle needed immaterial forms to explain intellect, which he mistakenly believed is capable of taking any form, thinking any material will have limitations that prevent it, instead of concluding, well, therefore our minds cannot take any form. There are things that are impossible for us to think, which is modern computer science would say, yes, there are just some things we are incapable of thinking because there are some constraints on the matter that's doing the thinking, and for deeper theoretical reasons than that too, they're just unthinkable things. So yeah, instead of concluding, since matter is limited, therefore we can't think anything, he took for granted we can think anything, therefore our thinking is immaterial. And that was a mistake, and that mistake led him to say some things about how intellects work and how the universe works, by having as a prime mover this divine immaterial intellect that moves things, that were mistaken and that look quite similar to some of the more otherworldly things that Plato said when it comes to forms. It's kind of where I'm at, and I think I saw a tweet earlier today about Heidegger giving Kant an F on his interpretation of Plato and Aristotle, and I'm quite self-conscious that probably somewhere there's a philosopher who will score my understanding of both Plato and Aristotle very poorly, but I guess that's just how it is. That's where I'm at right now.
Fair point.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Graham.
I was going to say, my take on that one is I think Aristotle's view of endoxa is he just didn't want to have to reinvent the wheel because he was too busy inventing entirely new fields of study for people. So, I'm just going to go, if I can go with the best that's available so far, I'm just going to roll with that because it frees up my time for the more important stuff. Good tag.
Okay, so now we can, if you guys agree, start to look at the intellectual descendants of the two schools of both the academy and the lyceum. So the next generation reminded me of Star Trek. And well, sometimes the next generation is even greater. Sometimes they are a bit more discrete. And in this case, for both schools, according to Peter Adamson, the immediate successors of Aristotle and Plato hardly rose as high as these giants, these titans of the intellect. But they kept the torch moving, and so that's worthy of praise and of expressing gratitude for, because some of these guys helped pre-Socratic thoughts arrive at us that would not have arrived otherwise, and also salvaged and preserved Plato's dialogues and Aristotle's volumes. So that's worthy of note. Firstly, we would like to go to the Old Academy. Here's a mosaic that supposedly represents people discussing philosophy, probably math, astronomy, in Plato's academy, which, mind you, is named after the garden where it was located. That was in turn named after a Greek hero called Hecademos. And so nowadays we are opening academies, and we are epistemologically unaware that we are continuing to make homage to this known Greek hero without even thinking about the Greek hero, which I find really amusing. And so for the Old Academy, here is a quote by Aristoxenus, which is one of the guys from the Lyceum. He says, Plato offered to give a public lecture on the topic of the good. An audience turned up, expecting to hear about how to acquire happiness, perhaps by way of wealth, health, and other such goods. Instead, they got a long lecture on mathematics and went away totally bemused. But maybe it's because their attention was lost. If they perhaps had paid attention of something like Plato saying, well, this is a perfect circle. You guys just need to be like the perfect circle. You need to be excellent, and especially excellent to one another. But probably they were asleep when Plato got to this point. I'm just conjecturing, of course, and joking. But I found this lack of awareness of making our content adequate to the target audience is. It's funny, it's amusing.
Yeah, but that's what you get when your conception of the good is this universal objective fact. And yeah, so a good speech is a good speech, and if it happens that your audience are slaves stuck in a cave, unable to appreciate the wisdom you got by going out of the cave, that's their problem. Like, what you should do is to give a good speech. And
yeah.
if your audience doesn't appreciate it, shouldn't deter you from giving a good speech.
What I like is that they knew enough not to heckle Plato over the speech, because you really don't want to pick a fight with a former Olympic wrestler. Tag.
Yes.
So I wonder how old he was and how old he was when he gave up wrestling. That said, I've wrestled with a person who's close to 60 and has a busted hip and a busted shoulder, and he totally kicked my ass. Completely. Didn't have a chance, not even a little bit. So yeah, an experienced wrestler, even if they're old and injured and wounded and not in their prime anymore, can still give you a hassle. So yeah. He was also much bigger than me. That does make a difference in wrestling. I wonder what Plato was. Plato was broad. We don't know how tall he was. I guess I bet he wasn't. I bet I'm taller than Plato was. I don't think he was much taller than 5'10". What do you guys think? I'm seriously now imagining whether I could take Plato in a wrestling match, because I do jiu-jitsu, and so I fancy myself as knowing a little bit how to wrestle. But
I will check my copy of Diogenes Laertius.
I'm picturing Plato more like about 5'8" and more built almost like sumo-like, or that low center of gravity and almost impossible to move him. Hey.
Yeah, you don't have to move him. You just climb on his back and strangle him. I don't know.
Well, when one is much heftier than the opponent, they can also always use the walrus technique, which is just to lie on the opponent. This was a joke said a couple of days ago by Elon Musk, who also it seems will face supposedly Mark Zuckerberg in a UFC ring. I wonder how that will go. Okay, so I'm looking at Diogenes Laertius' account on Plato, and let's see. It doesn't. I don't see if he's mentioning his build. I don't think so. I think he only mentions his physical aspects when he mentions that Plato was nicknamed Plato. His original name was Aristocles, and so he was named Plato. Maybe because he had a broad, his shoulders were broad or his chest was broad, but it can also be a confusion. And in fact, it's because his knowledge was broad, or because he had a broad forehead. So if even this late antiquity guy Diogenes Laertius wasn't completely sure, and so much less ourselves. We have no idea. Only if we had a life-size statue that we knew was made one-to-one in size. So I'm not sure if anything of that survived.
All right, I'm now totally googling average height of ancient Greece men. We're completely off topic and doing something a little ridiculous. So yeah, I guess this is about 5'8".
Well, you got to remember, you have to hide a bunch of them within a horse too. So you got to take that into account.
Yeah, work back from the what's that horse's name again? The Trojan horse. Yeah, work back from the size of the Trojan horse, figure out how many people they fit in there, and then calculate average height of Greeks. So like, I think I could take Plato in a wrestling match. It's not important whether we could take Plato in a wrestling match. It was just an offhand joke that got us on an amusing sidetrack.
Okay, so anyway, we don't know how big this guy was, but maybe for sake of just safety is number one priority, maybe it would be wise to not pick a fight with Plato, because we don't know what we might be contending with. And well, Peter Adamson mentions that it seems that Plato believed mathematics is at the core of philosophy, including ethics. So inquiry into the nature of the good is done via mathematics, as showcased by his speech. That was not a crowd pleaser. And Aristotle further puts his finger on the wound by saying, "The theory is complicated and mysterious." This coming from Aristotle is really funny. Because he just stands back and refuses to cut it, to start figuring out how the different pieces are put together, and he just accepts this fact.
Yeah, Adamson does Aristotle a nasty trick. They're saying Aristotle wasn't a fan of, I think, some of the students of Plato's doctrine, and he's our primary source for what the doctrine was. And then Adamson says, well, so taking Aristotle's word for what the doctrine is like taking Donald Trump's word about what communism is or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
first of all, I think Aristotle was a bit more educated and thoughtful than Trump. And also, he wasn't maybe that ideologically. So that was dirty by Adamson.
Yeah, it's
probably Aristotle's account is a bit biased, but that biased, unlikely, I think.
I was going to say, I think we can say Aristotle and Trump both have pomposity on their side. But I was going to say, I just have problems with Aristotle trying to throw stones at somebody else's theory of being complicated, getting his system, you know? Mysterious, I'll give you, but complicated? Come on. Okay.
Yeah. Let's move on. Peter Adamson also said that Plato claimed numbers are produced from two principles, and he referred to this because his immediate students and successors really emphasized this. So two principles: unity, a male principle; multiplicity, a female principle, also called the great and small. It almost sounds like multiplicity makes us remember atoms somehow. But anyway, in his time AS, he actually showcased what could be atoms, or the elements rather. Then Peter Adamson goes and says, you could get numbers by imposing some limits or unity on a continuum, like a musical scale. Numbers would emerge from the interaction of unity and multiplicity. And then he goes southwards. From their copulation are born the numbers. And you thought Pythagorean metaphysics was dull. So everyone cracking open their Pythagorean metaphysics books all of a sudden. Yeah, I never thought someone could mix copulation with the essentials of mathematics in a single sentence. But here you go.
I actually think it's quite understandable. So the people were trying to explain the origin of the universe, and they thought it was mathematical. And every living creature that has an origin, copulation is usually evolved. So if you conceive of the universe as a kind of living thing that came into being, the way living things came into being, copulation seems like a likely thing that would be evolved somehow. And if the underlying principles are mathematical principles, then why shouldn't the mathematical principles copulate with each other in order to give birth to the universe?
Yeah, exactly. And one wonders if unity and multiplicity are forms, since Plato was the forms guy, and the forms were like the arche, or the essentials of being. What kind of forms would copulate and how? So yeah, and numbers would come out of that. What does this take? What kind of undertaking is this?
Also, we have an analogous
exactly.
thing.
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Plato's describing them as principles, and what exactly is the difference between a principle and a form? You know, and when it comes to copulation and math and numbers, one thing that they have to deal with is the idea that copulation results sometimes in 1 + 1 = 3. Okay. That's pregnancy and all. Sorry.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say is, we have something similar in the verb having a brainchild, or like the idiom to have a brainchild is when ideas copulate and you have a new idea that's a baby of different ideas. So people still use that metaphor these days. And what's the difference between principles and forms? I think Aristotle kind of threw a bunch of things that were quite different under the category of principles when he discussed different people trying to describe the whole universe by appealing to different kinds of principles. And I think this this part of the Plato's doctrine and Plato's successors actually comes from that same piece from Aristotle when he does the physics, which we studied earlier. I think it just didn't come up. So he uses principles there so the atomists have their infinite number of principles, which are the atoms, and like atoms are principles in different sense than this unity and multiplicity is a principle. And there are also principles in different senses in which Aristotle's use of actuality and potentiality are principles. So yeah, he equivocates the use of principle here a little bit in order to be able to classify different cosmologies based on how many principles they evoke or invoke to explain the universe. A tag out on that.
Well, I think it's in order for me to show you something that I created that is related to this discussion. I'll just go forward. I was reserving it to the end because it's kind of like an aside, but maybe it's in order because it's like ideas. We've been processing many ideas here, and we are kind of wondering whether the ideas are what we could call technically bullshit, either by intention because they just want to expedite things and they might kind of cut corners, or because they are actually malicious and they want to fool people, or they really are not competent enough to formulate something, some theory that actually both is useful and also matches what the real world is doing. And so I kind of thought that when ideas really seem like they are wrong, probably they are wrong when it's so blatant, when we just look at them by first impression. So I would say 90% of the ideas that are blatantly wrong and under further examination are often wrong. While it's very, very rare that really apparently foolish ideas are actually right, I'd say very, very rare. This is, of course, my approximation, my attempt to put the finger on this. But there are also ideas that seem to have some merits, and Aristotle kind of showcased this by how he usually looks at endoxa, at reputed opinions, reputed positions, and he tries to wrestle with them. And even though he doesn't take them wholesale, he also maybe more or less half of the time he takes some ideas from them or just kind of discards them. But maybe it's more rare for them to be completely correct. Even though they are more often correct than when the ideas at surface level seem incorrect. And then there are ideas that in surface level give us a first impression. Wow, these guys came up with a really nice ontology or a really nice cosmology. It kind of makes sense surface level, but then people start to do experiments, start to make mathematical studies and whatnot. And this is one thing that I think is really frustrating, which is ideas that seem so promising often aren't correct, and they are wrong. Sometimes people assemble a really plausible looking model, and then it's completely wrong. Like a nice example is the geocentric model of the solar system. They had math demonstrating being used to predict the planets with the epicycles and everything. They just needed to add more circles, and it seems right. Also, the idea that the Earth is flat seems right at first impression. It's only by starting to involve math and some more rigorous experimentation, as was done by Eratosthenes in Egypt, benefiting from having access to parts of Egypt, of high Egypt, that are more south, to have objects that are completely perpendicular, having no shadow at all, due to the sun being completely overhead. And comparing at the same part of the day with objects higher up, with stakes or pillars higher up. And so he proved that the flat Earth idea is wrong mathematically and empirically. And then, well, oftentimes when ideas really seem right, there is something that we can extract from it that is useful, maybe like half of the time. And sometimes they are even completely correct, even though it's really hard to give an example other than perhaps the theories from Einstein, like general and special relativity, that have stubbornly refused to be disproven after many attempts. So yeah, this is my attempt to generalize what we have been dealing with from Thales to Aristotle.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It reminded me of some studies of the calibration of confidence judgments in expert judgment and decision making. So when experts are asked to make subjective forecasts and to or to answer questions that they don't know but asked to guess, and then also asked to guess what it's the probability that their guess is correct. A general finding is that people guess at the probability that they're correct too high, or when you ask people to provide intervals, they provide intervals that are too narrow. Say, if you ask people to provide their 90% confidence interval, they'll provide a confidence interval that's only correct like 50% of the time because it's too narrow. So that's been dubbed overconfidence effect. There's been a bunch of extra studies that show that people aren't always overconfident. There are some kinds of questions for some kinds of experts where they actually underconfident, and the structure of the questions, like the way you phrase them and the context and all that stuff, is quite important. So the results there are complicated and mysterious. So, but it reminded me of those kinds of studies of people's calibration of confidence, and also made me curious if, like, one of the effective ways to maybe remedy both overconfidence and underconfidence in judgment would be to get systematic feedback on the relationship between this appearance, this feeling that something seems bullshit, or this feeling that it seems to have some merits, or this feeling that it seems completely right. The functional relationship between that and the actual relative frequencies for when they turn out to be correct. Whether that may help calibrate. I think there probably have been studies trying to test different ways to calibrate experts better, and feedback is really important. I don't know if this specific kind of feedback is important for people to, like, say, do a, like, here's a doctrine or an doxa, do a quick body scan, really pay attention to how you feel about it. Do you feel suspicious, or do you feel confident that it seems right? And then relating that feeling to an actual probability in like a repeated thing, so a bunch of different doctrines, each time doing a body scan to check feeling, or doing introspection to sense how much it feels like bullshit, and then getting feedback on how often you're correct, or that feeling is correct, so that you can then hopefully learn over time to introspect a feeling of confidence and relate that to rough estimates of probabilities. And if you were really good at that, there are a bunch of like decision analysis software for free online. If you shove probabilities in them and you shove utilities into them, they'll calculate you utility maximizing decisions. So that might turn out to be quite useful if you. Otherwise, those calculators could be really difficult to use. If you could give someone a multi-attribute utility calculator and say, use this to decide which career change to make, it's really difficult to actually use those calculators, because you have to come up with a bunch of probabilities and you have to come up with a bunch of utilities, and they're really difficult to come up with. So yeah, that may be interesting. It may also just be help people develop a sense for for clues in the doctrines themselves that are indicators for likeliness to be wrong. So one of the clues that works pretty well is if statements are very general. So if they say the only thing that ever matters, or everywhere, always, or for all, they're very often incorrect, and it's often fairly easy to find. One example is enough to technically prove it incorrect, one contradictory example. And then often people will say like, oh, well, it's the exception that proves the rule. Like the actual expression is it's the exception that tests the rule, and the meaning of that expression is that one exception can prove a rule false. It's like it does. You don't prove a rule by finding an exception that contradicts it. That's not how that works. You can prove a rule false by one example that contradicts it. So it's often easy to find examples like that. And so recently, like the statement, all we need to become wise is self-awareness. For a lot of people that seems right, but like that overgeneralization, like the only thing, another way to state it, like you need nothing else except for self-awareness to be wise, is incorrect, I think. And it's fairly easy to come up with examples of things that if you don't have them, it's unlikely for you to be wise, that aren't self-awareness. So yeah, to like one of the clues is it a very strong, very general claim? Those are often wrong. More nuanced, more qualified claims are more likely to be correct, although they can also still be wrong. But yeah, just general features of the claims themselves can maybe inform people to become better at spotting bullshit. There's also a bunch. I think you probably something worthwhile doing is taking like a whole year course, just studying methods for deception detection. So detecting con artists and charlatans and frauds and rhetoricians, and I don't know, really manipulative sales tactics. Probably worth the time to learn how to do that.
It's almost like I would need to add over this slide also like these kind of neon Vegas arrows pointing at when it seems completely right. It's still quite often that it is very frequently completely bullshit, and probably that explains the entirety of skeptical schools and skeptical movements. So to kind of suspend your belief in something, maybe even indefinitely, and being comfortable with having the question without a definite answer, because if you attach yourself like a clam to one of the shiniest and most promising answers, maybe you're attaching yourself to something that is wrong, that is bullshit, and it will backfire more sooner or later. So in comparison to be comfortable with having a question and keep hanging on with the question is probably an attribute of wisdom.
Yeah, no, I was going to say you have a pretty good way to evaluate the indoxagon there, where your first impression of it, you're basically evaluating your prejudices that you've built based off of your prior experiences, off of what they're telling you, and that's going to produce that appearance that you're coming through as to how it looks. And again, it's a good general description of how that goes. And what Nerdalliun was talking about, I was always explained to me as like honing your intuition. And one of the best ways that that I've always found to do it is working on noting those rare occurrences. It's like, how did I actually feel in those times when something that seemed like total bullshit turned out to actually be right? Because that's where you can sit there, and that if you can note how you felt there, and if you can note how you felt different at theirs versus the things that were total bullshit, you can work on your intuition, your detectors there, and same things as to, the things that seemed completely right that turned out to be bullshit. Another rare instance that you can test your feelings that way, and that was one of the works there. And I guess again, showing, my experience, my autism, whatever. I always took the exception proves the rule and linked it to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where it was the exception that you can't prove true is what proved his theorem correctly. And last one is some of what you're talking about is contrarianism, where you have to go kind of swimming counter the stream, sort of like Warren Buffett with his investing, where people are fearful. That's when you need to be confident and invest, and if they're all confident, that's when you need to be scared and run for the hills. Gonna tag on this.
Okay, I think this has been a fair kind of way to summarize us looking at like these people's concepts of first principles or their cosmologies and whatnot, and trying to summarize it. Let's try to move on to the students. So let's see, where were we? So we saw this thing about the theory being complicated and mysterious, the part of the numbers having steamy relationships or arising from steamy relationships. Then this anecdote about Xenocrates that is told by Aristotle, I also found amusing. So Xenocrates asks an aspiring philosopher, do you know anything about geometry or astronomy? And he says, I do not. And then Xenocrates goes, you give me no handles for philosophy. Well, I put here in fine print that this is in keeping with Plato's recommendation of using math and astronomy as a stepping stone for philosophy, and also with the supposed saying at the doors of the academy. So if you don't know geometry or astronomy or math and astronomy, according to Plato, you cannot be a good person.
I don't think it's entirely. Mind you, Socrates may have said something like that. At least among some of the Greeks, they used mathematics more or less for all of teachable knowledge. And for Socrates, everybody does the best they know, so the only way you could do good is if you knew the good, and if you knew the good, that would amount to some kind of mathematical knowledge. So yeah, I think people may say that. But another way to look at this that's a little further from, I think, Socrates and Plato's views, is to understand mathematics to understand mathematics a little differently than most people understand mathematics. For a lot of people, mathematics is about numbers and maybe graphs, but a lot of mathematicians make the point that really mathematics is the art of arguments about patterns, and so especially the Greek kind of math that was common geometry. If you pick up Euclid's Elements, it's full of sentences, mostly the very few numbers, and there's some diagrams or whatever, but it's very long arguments, just one argument after the other, making demonstrations and proofs. And the kind of philosophy these guys were doing was to make similar kinds of arguments that the mathematicians were making. So they're basically saying, well, you need some training in that kind of argument, or like one way to think of what they might have been saying. I don't think this is exactly what they would have said actually, but one way to interpret them maybe a little bit more reasonable than they might have been, is to say in order to do philosophy you need to be really good at rigorous deductive arguments, rigorous logical arguments, and the way to get practice in those kinds of arguments, or the best way, is to practice mathematical arguments. You get lots of chances to do fairly comparatively simple arguments about simple things, and you get feedback whether you're right or wrong, so you can learn to get good at those arguments. And if not, it may be very difficult for you to spot a bad argument from a good one, and you might be swayed by rhetoric, because a lot of rhetoric superficially looks similar to mathematical arguments, but they're invalid compared to mathematical arguments, and people who have no training in mathematics can find it very difficult to spot the difference. And so, yeah, I think they've had this frustration with people finding invalid rhetorical arguments that superficially look like valid arguments to be very appealing to people who don't have training in mathematical arguments. And people who do have mathematical arguments have a better shot at seeing why the rhetorical arguments are invalid. So yeah, I think they preferred students familiar with mathematics or trained in mathematics for that reason, because they had more practice in rigorous argument and spotting invalid arguments, I think.
I agree with what you say, but I was going to take it in a slightly different direction, and that's the specificity on geometry and astronomy is related to those being more eternal, unchanging, and universal. And it's the idea of philosophy being the relationship between the internal universal, the truth, and this changing world that we're in. And to a certain extent, that requirement on the academy gate for mathematics, reads to the sophist, abandon all hope, tag.
I suspect it also had a lot to do with why it took a couple of centuries for Plato and Aristotle's work to become very influential. Like, probably that kind of rigorous argument and mathematical requirements was as unpopular, or maybe even more unpopular back in the day in ancient Greece as it would be now. So compared to like sociology or arts or psychology or something, that a math department isn't the most popular department at universities. Lots of people really hate math. So if you want to make your philosophy unpopular, tie it strongly to mathematics. It'll take a while for anyone to pay attention to you.
Exactly. Gender studies is a much better place to pick up chicks. Tag.
You went straight for the kill. Yeah, well, maybe it's because mathematics courses or disciplines since first grade aren't fun. They aren't playful. They have squeezed all playfulness and gaming and games as possible from maths. Especially at younger ages, where I think there is hardly any reason or justification for that. Very uptight, especially in the primary school. Maybe I'm generalizing here, but yeah, give these kids a slack. They like games, they like playing, and there is a lot of playfulness in potential in learning mathematics. And I think the perspective or the picture that people have in their minds of what is math in terms of its either appeal or dreariness could be a bit shifted, at least if there was this a bit more emphasis on playfulness at younger ages, especially.
Yeah, mathematics also has this aspect to it that it can be very frustrating to get things wrong after repeated attempts. Dealing with the frustration, I think, is difficult for young people. And the thing, in addition to making it playful, that can help a lot, but another thing that helps a lot for people is to have personal tutoring where students can be coached through frustration to calm down and to try again, and also when the curriculum and the difficulty level can be adjusted so as not to overwhelm students with frustration. So those two things, I think the pace of the instruction and what of the math gets instructed causes a lot of students to suffer overwhelming frustration with mathematics, and then they kind of tune out. And then also the fact that the instruction is often very dry and boring and could be much more playful. Especially a topic like probability theory can be tied very closely to a whole bunch of games of chance. There are lots
you just made a point, probably inadvertently, that for people to be more tolerant of the frustrative potentials of trying and failing to solve math problems, philosophies of tranquility like Stoicism seem that they have maybe some potential or purpose there.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think most people's ideas of learning math is hour upon endless hour of speed tests interspersed with an occasional word problem. And who doesn't love that? Tag.
I mean, winning those tests feels kind of good. So there's like a couple of kids who usually win, who get some joy out of it. Everyone else kind of walks away a loser. Video games can
winners. They're all winners because they learned the math, Nerdalliun. Don't you know that?
They participate.
But actually, video games can be really unfun for exactly the same reason. I used to play video games in high school. I kind of stopped playing video games as an adult. And every now and then I think, I'd like to get into a video game. And then often the video games, especially the online ones, if you immediately get thrown into a room of people with thousands of hours of experience in that game, on top of tens of thousands of hours of video gaming experience in a whole bunch of other games that are similar, and you haven't been playing any of video games, you just get your ass kicked so bad that you just can't do anything. You just get completely demolished, and there's no fun in that. So, and that's a thing that drives a lot of people away from competitive video gaming if they're coming at it as noobs. And playing against bots who are much easier to play against can be a lot of fun for those people. But playing online can just be a brutal, humiliating experience and relentless. Because who's gonna give the poor new person a chance to do things as well? No, they're just gonna take as many kills as they can. Of course, they just farm, spawn camp the person or whatever.
In attempt to address your point, I would say that before starting with unknown strangers, with unknown skill levels, probably higher skill levels, very higher, much higher, a possibility is to start with friends.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, one of the bright, shiny students of Plato's is called a guy called Eudoxus. He's from Ionia, Cnidos. So he had a really travel-filled life. Traveled to Athens at 23. Attended some lectures by Plato, but left. Even went to Egypt to learn some math. So maybe he's more prepared for Plato the next time. Did further travels, like he went to the Propontis, to the court of Mausolus, and he was gathering students of his own, maybe just to hand over to the academy when he returns to Athens after some time. And then he is considered learned enough and important enough to assume the leadership of the academy, while Plato is absent. So kind of like the steward of the academy temporarily. He is even reportedly one of Aristotle's teachers. And devised mathematical models of the planetary motions we see in the night sky. Probably these models that assumed the Earth in the center of the cosmos and used some tricks of mathematics to account for the retrograde motion of these wandering stars that we call planets. And planets is just a word that comes from Greek, and it means wandering stars. Maybe moving on, because there's no point here made to contest.
I did have
Go
a
ahead.
couple quick comments. Is one of them is he invented the epicycle apparently, and the other one is you can sit here and see one of the reasons why Aristotle got passed over for running the academy later, where somebody like Eudoxus didn't. Is Eudoxus brought his own students with him. He brought some assets to the academy. Aristotle was just trying to get promoted. This was more of, it looks like more of a merger of it, and for him taking over for Plato. Just wanted to mention that. We can move on.
Okay. Yeah, a nice complementary point to complement the academy's history. Then we have Speusippus, who is actually really from Athens, Plato's nephew. So he had something going for him. He that nepotism potential. When Plato died, he inherited the academic headship. And he also is supposedly a guy that incorporated further Pythagoras doctrines into Platonism. Numbers supposedly said that unless you can enumerate all the ways one thing differs from another, you lack knowledge about both things. Probably this guy would be a fan of the spot the difference games with two pictures, and there are slight differences between the two, and you need to find all the differences. If you don't find all the differences, you haven't won the game.
Definitely, and here you have nepotism passing on the academy.
Yeah. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, this was the guy that Aristotle was passed on the second time, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, he got passed on. This one was nepotism that he got passed on the second time. So he said, I'm just going to go on my own.
This time he just said, enough. I will build my school with blackjack and hookers. Actually, it doesn't say that. That's Bender from Futurama. But probably without forms and concrete and the empirical methods and giraffes. Okay, so moving on. In summary of the Old Academy, the early Old Academy, the early Academy of Plato, Aristotle tells us about Speusippus, and of course we must have this, take with this with a grain of salt, because after all it's the competition that is kind of showcasing the attributes of their rivals. So basic principles from Speusippus, the one or monad, and multiplicity or dyad. From them are derived the further principles from these basic foundations. The monad interacts with the dyad to generate the numbers. We all know how this is. Probably censorship and stuff, so it's family friendly. Then geometrical figures arise, example triangles. So triangles are really important and foundational. The soul of the world then builds a physical universe on the basis of the geometrical figures, which harkens to Plato's Timaeus and its account of the elements being made up of triangles. I found that well, it shows that at least they are consistent. They are going, they are following their texts. And Speusippus reportedly said this on the Arche of Unity. The principle of unity is beyond even goodness and being. So really big deal. Since the principle is the source of these things, it cannot partake of them. So it's so by being above of goodness, it doesn't even partake of it. It's above and beyond goodness.
Yeah, something I remember from Peter Adamson's treatment of this is him just pointing out the influence it would have on later Christian theologians who would have debates about whether God is something we can comprehend with our own intellects or whether it's something completely beyond our intellects, whether it's something quite like us that could just know everything and be everywhere at once, and or whether it's something closer to this unity that's beyond goodness and being unfathomable in principle to humans.
Yeah, this comes across very much as a different formulation of the Tao principle. And again, much of like Anaximander was talking about with his apeiron. It seems like, if you look at the formlessness as unity. Just going to tag, we can move on.
Okay, so then there is Xenocrates, who picked up from his successor, his predecessor, has a monad in the dyad generating first principles, envisions 3 levels of reality: forms, mathematical entities. So it's kind of like the sandwich model of Platonism. And in the middle level, of course, are the numbers, and soul is like a moving number, brings motion of life and the structure associated with number. And then below the lowest level bodies, you can actually see physical stuff that the Platonists are stereotypically considered guys that were more or less dismissive of the material world. It almost looks like a caste system, to be honest. And they just disparage the lowest caste.
Yes, maybe there's a bit of innovation here. So in Plato's cave, you can either be in the cave looking at shadows, or you could be outside or enlightened. It seems like Xenocrates says, well, no, there's somewhere in between levels of reality. That there are the highest truths, and then there's the lowest material truths, and the in between is where people are. Where you get minds and soul and things.
Yeah, for me, I'm not sure exactly what the big difference between forms and mathematical entities are. They seem, like they would be a fair amount of overlap, and I want to know the specific difference. Just going to tag.
Okay. And then, so before we go to Alexander, I have to apologize because I have the slides here prepared for the Academy. I was just finishing them right now, and I can download them. So just a moment while we are solving technical difficulties for what seems like the very first time, which is amazing considering how many hours we have already gone. And so let's see.
We've had some other kinds of technical difficulties. I think I've started to play the wrong video, queued the wrong video to play before. We've had some connection issues, but all in all, these, like from a technical standpoint, these streams have gone pretty smoothly.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, there was also the little thing about in the first episode, we used some music that
yeah,
had copyright on it.
Thanks for reminding me about that blunder.
Live and learn.
Yeah, live and learn. So I tried really, really hard to find art on the peripatetic Lyceum or the Aristotelian Lyceum. It's really hard because we only have pictures of the ruins according to Google. But these creators of video games really lend us a hand. This obscure game that I've never heard about, that's probably similar to Civilization. It's called Call to Power in second edition. they made a very nice looking peripatetic lyceum. It looks like a theater in the middle, basically a circular theater, not an amphitheater, which is only a semicircle. And probably Aristotle and the other teachers of the lyceum could teach from the middle, and the students would be sitting in the stepwise benches around, pretty much like many lecture halls, circular lecture halls or semicircular lecture halls that still exist today. And well, one cannot talk about the peripatetics without talking about the second biggest figure, Theophrastus. He was, to my mind, Aristotle's sidekick, basically, because while Aristotle was kind of powering through zoology, this guy was also cutting the untreated bushes of botany, and so he focused on botany, wrote also about the causes of dizziness, sweat, and fatigue. So a little bit of seemingly medical literature there going for him. Wrote about God's influences on our cosmos through heavenly motion. So a bit maybe inspired from Plato's Timaeus, and also Aristotle talking about the first cause, and how the first cause cannot be caused by anything, and just by being the celestial objects move by wanting to be like it, as far as I remember from our last session. And then he generally accepts Aristotle's teleology. Nature does nothing in vain, as his friend would say. Wonders what the purpose of some natural phenomena might be. For instance, why men have nipples. I even, when I found this point, I even asked Twitter about this. I thought it would be a question to ask Twitter. These are the kinds of philosophical questions to ask Twitter. The second one, I probably wouldn't raise so many eyebrows. Why deer lose their antlers? Probably there are some deer fanatics around, but every single person has nipples, even males. It turns out. And so he mentions, just like Aristotle does, many Ionian philosophers, making Theophrastus the second most important means to study pre-Socratic philosophers, apart from Aristotle, and did a critical discussion of pre-Aristotelian theories of sensation. Yeah, so Theophrastus, a hand for Theophrastus.
Yeah, Aristotle's well, the Robin to Aristotle's.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't say it; you said it.
Yeah, the only thing I really could remember from Theophrastus is that he did botany studies, quite detailed, and that he's also one of, indirectly, one of our main sources for pre-Socratic thinkers. But yeah, the thing about him broadly agreeing that nature doesn't do anything in vain, but still being a little curious about some things that seem quite in vain, is something I forgot, but it's a good point about him.
Yeah, these grotesque abnormalities of some beings in nature arising with deformities. Like for instance, I once found a herb. They usually have, and this is to relate to botany directly. A herb growing here near my house, that instead of having a cylindrical stem, it had a very broad stem that was like, instead of being like a finger of mine, it was broad like my hand, all from top to bottom, and was like half my height. It was a really alien looking plant, and this was a rare deformity indeed, because I've never seen ever since and before any plant like that. So yeah, deformities related presumably to genetic mutations can occur both in plants and animals.
Yeah, I just can't help but picture the scene being played out with Aristotle sitting there saying, "I'm bored with this. Theophrastes, come here. You take over this. I'm going to do something else now." Hey,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna go miscount some ribs while you're trying to figure out this misshapen herb.
I'm going to dissect these animals, maybe even alive, or vivisect rather, and you just keep cutting these plants. Maybe he was more squeamish, Theophrastus, thus he felt more attracted to botany. And then there is Strait of Lampsacus. These less known guys I have less material about, so succeeded Theophrastus, leading the Lyceum, and unlike Aristotle and Theophrastus, Strato focused on physical theories rather than empirical research. So maybe he was kind of like the first theoretical physicist or something like that.
Actually, I think the work of the old school Platonists, old academy Platonists, seems a bit like theoretical physics. They're trying to do a theory of everything, and it's mathematical. It's just kind of bad because it's 2,500 years old. So, but yeah, they seem like doing the same kind of thing that say there's a YouTube channel, Theories of Everything. They get all kinds of different people on, but a lot of the people on the Discord server for that really into mathematical theories of the cosmos. So that seems like just like a space that's quite similar to the vibe of the old academy Platonists, that people try to use geometry or use whatever other kinds of math to work out theories of everything, the whole cosmos described just with math.
Maybe it's a wild goose chase, because as we kind of got the impression since the beginning of our journey through the history of philosophy, probably the wisest approach is, instead of aiming for a theory that encapsulates everything, is using theories as tools fit for the occasion, and trying heuristically to fit the best tool to the best occasion, basically. And I seriously doubt that we will ever have the end of history for science. I doubt that. But prove me if I'm wrong, or disagree with me rather.
No, I'm on board with that. I think just do it very easily and say everything is everything, nothing is nothing. There you go. There's your theory. End of story. That's not useful for doing anything with. So I think that's true. Everything is everything and nothing is. But it's like empty tautologies about everything and nothing.
Or maybe this is so profound that it escapes us.
I was going to say thank you, Parmenides.
But Parmenides said everything is one.
End of discussion.
Yeah, that's his theory of everything. Yeah, maybe we just need to sit for 3 days under a tree and meditate on this profound truth, and then it'll all make sense after 3 days.
Or maybe we need to tell ourselves a very nice story, appealing story about just that which you just described, and maybe it will make sense. Everything will make sense.
I like that.
But
Everything
like,
is wrong. Prove me wrong. Everything is one. Prove me wrong.
change my mind, because some college campuses with a lot of tables. Change my mind. Everything is one.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say, like a lot of the models in astrophysics and stuff are related to things that get used elsewhere. So the physics of light and of subatomic particles gets informed to build lasers that are building computer chips, or to all kinds of other things. To like the physical models inform the design of nuclear reactors or fusion reactors, or that kind of thing. So you have these mathematical models that can explain some things in ways that are useful for engineers to build things with, and that seems more worthwhile. But hoping to have one mathematical theory that'll be useful for everything. So you just really need to know one mathematical model, and from that mathematical model you'll get all of the uses that you could possibly want. I think won't happen, and there's at least one physicist that I think explains why this won't work. He talks about computational irreducibility, basically meaning that there's at different scales of conceptualizing of things, there are processes that can basically be described mathematically as computational processes, and at different scales these processes are, in terms of complexity, equivalent, and the complexity means that you can't take a shortcut from between levels of explanations. So you can't, or even within a level of explanation, some processes, the only way you can find out what happens in the end of the process is by actually running the process. So there's no way to mathematically predict what's going to happen.
Hold on. Is a viable example like comparing the behavior of subatomic particles and molecules, for instance?
Yeah, there are a bunch of examples of things you might want to predict about subatomic particles and also molecules. The things Wolfram was studying when he found this principle are cellular automata, which are just little grids of blocks that change color based on rules, and the rules refer to the blocks surrounding them. So they evolve, and it's literally just little squares that evolve into squares, and they could be either black or white, and whether they're black or white they change depending on rules that refer to themselves and to their neighbors, and you can write different kinds of rules for them. And very simple rule systems leads to processes of evolution that just have wildly chaotic and unpredictable behaviors. And that's a ubiquitous thing. It happens in molecules, it happens in cells, it happens in weather systems, in economies, in people's decision making, in very many different kinds of very simple computer simulations. So these little cellular automata are just one example of mathematical systems that have this complexity in quite simple systems. Anyway, the point was that there are many of these systems that basically are Turing complete, and you can't predict stuff about them. And so what ends up happening is you have different ways of parsing the world. And so thinking about molecules is a different way to thinking about psychological diseases, is a bit different way to thinking about economic systems. And you have different ontologies. You have assumptions about the basic things are built of. And you can basically build computational systems that are equivalently complex at those different scales. And yeah, depending on your needs, you're going to get a different system. So you're never going to get the answers to foreign relations and the modern economy derived from fundamental physics. This is not going to happen. So you're going to always need things in addition to fundamental physics. But for all we know, we may learn new things about subatomic particles or and their behavior that may be useful in building new kinds of computer or new kinds of energy sources or propulsion. So it's not to say like fundamental physics is something that people should stop studying. It's just I don't think physics is ever going to be the answer to everything. Like we're never going to have one answer that explains everything we want to know about everything. So in that sense, I don't think we ever will have a theory of everything. Though we can always have more theories as purposes proliferate. And as we're seeing, like the technologies and stuff we're creating is raising new questions, like new phenomena, like the behavior of the language models that are making the news in terms of AI nowadays is to a great degree a scientific mystery. And so before those AI systems existed, there wasn't a question about how they work. Now they exist, and now it's a puzzle to scientists. How do these things actually work? And so like new scientific fields are popping up, and there's loads of different fields. The study of neuroeconomics wasn't a thing 40 years ago, so that's a new field. I think another one that's I'm new to. I don't know actually who was the first person who thought of himself as doing this. Economic anthropology. And yeah, so I actually think, if anything, we're going to have a proliferation of more theories, and they're going to have specialized use cases, and that's okay. Yeah. So in terms of theories of everything, I see for some people it's really important. They really want to know the answer to everything. They want to know the religious answer to everything, or the scientific answer to everything, or the ethical answer to everything. And I kind of don't sympathize with that desire. It's not a desire that I share.
Yeah, the truth is out there, but probably we will never grasp it, and maybe that's for the best. Therefore, we always have more going for us. Imagine if reality is a video game, and in my experience, when I mastered completely a video game or activated cheat codes, it was fun for a little while, but I would drop the game very quickly because it stopped providing me challenge. And at least the universe has that going for it. It is continually providing challenge. I'm not sure if it's doing that by design or intentionally or whatnot, or as that tell us, but it seems that is what's going on. And having said that, technical issue here, Fly. It's zoology getting back at me for mentioning vivisection and whatnot. It's what you mentioned about the study of AI, probably fields of classification of AI, like as if they were, it's like zoology of AI in a sense, and there are different forms of neural nets, and they have different functions and different potentials or different features or whatnot, or one neural net is really good at predicting weather patterns, but it's kind of crap at language, being a language model or something like that, while others are really great at outputting images, and they are probably very different in terms of structure due to these functions. So, and I also am pretty much a layman in regards to how AI works, or rather what we call AI.
I was going to say one aspect I was going to specify and agree with is about science not being the be-all, end-all, because science has been built since Kant specifically excludes a person's subjective experience from consideration. All science deals with is the objective world. It doesn't say anything about the subjective world, and that's why science is so disconnected from the study of ethics and all. Gonna tag.
So yeah, you just hold on. so you're saying me that you cannot sit and meditate and all of a sudden say that you have all the answers. and
you can do that, but it's not scientific answers.
So that's very contentious. There are some people who consider themselves to be scientists studying conscious subjective experience, and there are people who think that's completely ridiculous. That's totally impossible. And there are people who claim that contemplative practices like meditation and yoga are a kind of science, so that Buddhism really isn't a religion, it's a science of mind. and there are people who think that's ridiculous, but it's contested ground. It's a very controversial ground. Something that amused me a lot was when you compared life to a video game, and you talked about video games requiring to give a sense of challenge, and it made me think of difficulty curves that people sort of analyze how engaging video games is based on how challenging it is, and there's a balance that needs to happen to keep it optimally engaging. And it made me thought of this problem that a lot of people puzzle about why very rich countries often have this problem that people suffer depression in those countries. And I thought maybe it has to do with the fact that for life to feel engaging and worthwhile, the difficulty curve needs to be optimal. And so if you're way too poor, the difficulty curve is too much, and you kind of get despondent. So being born in abject poverty, especially in a context where everyone else is very rich, it seems to not matter so much if everyone else is also poor. It can make people lose hope and despair. And also, I think being born too rich can take the challenge out of life and make anything you might do feel like meaningless and purposeless, and make people also feel turn to despair or suffer from depression. So it was amusing to me thinking of the amount of wealth, especially the amount of relative wealth people are born with, can have this effect of changing the difficulty curve of life, and that make life feel more engaging or less engaging, or more meaningful and less meaningful. And what you want is to be somewhere in the middle in terms of relative wealth, so you're not suffering abject poverty, and you're not so wealthy that anything you do is kind of a meaningless pastime that's completely unnecessary.
This discussion reminded me of this book, Theory of Flow, by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which is very popular among video game designers who want to design and tailor their game to fit to people's psychological needs of an adequate level of challenge that is by software made dynamically adequate to their changing skills. Of course, people, when they approach a video game for the first time, they are noobs, they are beginners. If the game starts really hard on them, they will give up. They will be frustrated, like from the math problems we mentioned, and they will give up. But people don't give up video games nowadays so easily as math problems, because there is a very sophisticated fine-tuning, especially in video games that are properly designed, that make a nice match between the person's skills and giving them challenges at the edge of their skill level, where they kind of fail, but they don't fail so much that they become too frustrated, but they also don't win too much as they become bored. Well, although the universe doesn't act like a video game, because the video game kind of holds your hand and shows you where to go next to face challenges that are more suited to your skill level or the character that you're playing in the game. Reality just doesn't give you any hints or suggestions. It is you yourself. You have to figure out. Suppose that we end this voyage of the history of philosophy. Then what? You are kind of armed with the knowledge and wisdom that you've acquired in this adventure, or this quest rather. What comes next? Anyway, we can return to our topic, but feel free to make complaints or prove I'm wrong, or rather disagree with me.
Now, I'm kind of keen to talk about Alexander.
Yeah, I'm keen to move on.
Sure. So I have So I have this guy Eudemus here, just to really briefly say that probably he is the reason why we have the Eudemian ethics that I have not yet picked up, in contrast to the Nicomachean ethics, but it's there. I know that it exists, which is good. Then there was Aristoxenus, who relays the story about Plato's lecture on the good. So taking a jab at the academy from the Lyceum, and he wrote about music. So also maybe keeping the tradition alive from Pythagoras. And so now we will talk about Alexandros. Here I offer you two of the depictions of Alexander. So in hopes for us to get a feel of his likeness.
Yeah.
And Graham, I heard you were anticipating having the chance to talk about Alexander.
No, absolutely. No, Alexander, he's just one of those one of my favorite characters. He's so pivotal in the ancient world, and that's where we're kind of putting to bed Hellenic philosophy, and then he ushered in the Hellenistic age. And that's where we're talking about all the successors to Plato and Aristotle and all. And no, I was going to say it's he very short life, but probably arguably one of the most influential people who ever lived.
He really squeezed utility out of those years, those short years that he lives in, didn't he?
Yeah. In a lot of ways,
he wasn't the only one squeezing, but yeah, he definitely made use of his time.
I was going to say he and Mozart gave each other a run for the money there. So,
well. But did Mozart go from Greece to northern India with pointy sticks? Really long pointy sticks. Can we even compare here? Draw a comparison.
And the horse. Don't forget the horse. He had Bucephalus.
Yes.
So, you know.
Yes. Well, it's there. The horse is there as well. They immortalized the horse as well, and the mosaic didn't degrade where the horse is drawn as well. So it's great.
They also had shields. So shields, horses, and pointy sticks.
Yeah. So we have here a moment, maybe a nice story kind of moment. Of course, I think it was kind of meaningless in terms of consequences of him cutting the Gordian knot. But people like to tell this story because there was a prophecy that whoever cut the Gordian knot would rule over all Asia. And I think they're talking about what is today Turkey, not Asia, from Turkey to Japan or something like that. And he cut it instead of just entangling the knot, which maybe he would have done it and have died trying to do it. So he just took his sword and cut the knot. And he continued. He continued on. Just to give you guys a summary, and I propose after this summary, Graham can complement this because Graham has probably a bit more of content to complement this. So born in the northern part of Greece, which we call Macedon, tutoring from 13 to 16 years of age by Aristotle. While his father, Philip II, was around, he controlled most of Greece, notably except Sparta. At age 16, Philip II was assassinated, and Aristotle was succeeded. And there was a lot of cutthroat and cloak and dagger and backstabbing happening while Alexander was young, and up to Alexander's death, and after Alexander's death, there was a lot of backstabbing. At least from what I gleaned in a documentary about Aristotle that showed the historical events before even Aristotle was born, just to give a context, during Alexander's life rather, and after Alexander died. At age 17, he didn't wait much after succeeding to start invading the Persians, which is quite notable, because until then there were two Persian wars and the Greeks were at the receiving end, not at the giving end. Age 17 to 31, campaign through Persia, Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan. So quite a globetrotter, not just walking around. He was actually conquering cities, either by siege or making them surrender immediately, or open field battles. And at age 32, he died of a fever, and no one knows exactly what kind of illness or poisoning took his life. I also listed here the battles. All of them were victories, some of them overwhelming victories, even against difficult odds, or rather seemingly impossible odds, and they won, probably by their daring and audacious character. Alexander really managed to rouse the troops' morale, seemingly, and made them do what seemingly were foolish acts, uh, putting themselves in danger, but it paid off, and they even frightened larger armies than they were. And so, yeah, this is the summary that I managed to put together of Alexander. And guys, feel free to compliment, especially our Alexander specialist here, Graham.
I'll let Nerdalliun have first swing.
Yeah, thanks, because I really don't have all that much to to add. So if Graham goes first, I'll have nothing to add. I remember,
Yeah.
I recall, Alexander inherited the military technology of the organization of a phalanx, which was was a novel innovation at the time, and other people didn't have really an answer to it, and that was a big role in his military success. But not only that, he was quite a daring general in terms of tactics. I think one of the things that Graham mentioned in his write-up about Alexander, like leading from the front, fighting with his troops, and there's a famous speech of him when his troops was unhappy with him, and he kind of pointed to the scars on his body, like, see, I'm suffering with you guys, and like, you guys have turned from just regular city dwellers into emperors of like the Greek world under my rule, and how dare you be ungrateful for what I've done? I've suffered just like you. Like, yeah, I get you're suffering. I'm suffering too. This is fucking war. That's how that goes. What do you want from me? And he won them over back to his side. I I may have got that speech a little wrong, but there's something like that. There's a speech that happened. Yeah, not too much to add. I think I'll tang it to Graham.
Yeah, no, he did. His father Philip was the one who developed the phalanx, and it's that ability for them to instantly form into a fighting position, to instantly all of a sudden, almost like a porcupine like, where that was just a new innovation, and their mobility, and there was Philip's innovation. And just a quick correction on your screen here, Alexander was a couple of years older. He got his first position at 16 under Philip, but he was actually 19 when Philip was assassinated.
Thanks.
And no problem. And the other one was some of the point of the Gordian knot was, I think the interpretation of Asia there also would have included the Persian Empire as well at that point in time, since they were the big ones holding sway in a lot of Turkey and Asia Minor there. And interesting aside on the Gordian knot is it was tied by this merchant named Gordius who was actually from Macedon, the same area that Alexander was from. And that was an example of, kind of where I consider Alexander a philosophical successor to Aristotle, where he's putting into practice all of the things that he did his learning with Aristotle, and he spent, the rest of his short life putting into practice some of the stuff that he learned from Aristotle. So, no, I was going to say what the first incident, if you want, I don't know if you have the taming of Bucephalus at all, but that's really the first time that Alexander came to his father's attention, was the application of his observation. And again, a lot of it was almost like nonlinear logic, thinking outside the box. And where he broke Bucephalus because it was one of the best horses they had seen, but nobody was able to ride it. So his father was going to Philip was going to reject it. And Alexander sat there and said, "Let me break the horse." And Philip sat there and said, "Yeah, if you do it, I'll give it to you." And Alexander had noticed that Bucephalus was scared of his shadow. So he kept the horse pointed towards the sun, and he was able to break the horse that way. And the horse accompanied with him was arguably his best friend all the way to India. Finally died in India, probably of wounds there, and actually named a city after him in India.
Just one thing. I think that Plato's ghost would love the idea that Aristotle's student pointed his horse toward the sun to tame him.
No, I do. I think I think that Plato would definitely appreciate that one.
Yeah.
No, and it was after Alexander tamed Bucephalus that he was able to. That Philip sat there and proclaimed, you need a country greater than Greece. You need something, and that's when he brought in Aristotle as Alexander's tutor.
Yeah, I'm sitting here and considering the symbolic nature of that story of Bucephalus being afraid of his shadow, and Alexander turning him towards the sun, and like the relation between the cave allegory and Platonism. Wondering whether that story may have been invented with specific symbolic elements in it, or otherwise it's a very interesting coincidence.
Yeah, I had never considered the symbolic elements of it before Rogério brought it up. That was a good catch by him.
I'm always wary of the symbolism right now. When the sun appears in Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, I'm always kind of, oh, okay, this guy read Plato back to back, and he's he's kind of alluding all the time with his noontide and whatnot, and going under of the sun and whatnot. Yeah, so. Maybe I'm overthinking or overanalyzing it, but well, I thought it's striking.
Oh, it definitely is. I'm surprised I hadn't noticed it before now, but that's a really strong catch. No, and more of that application of Alexander's learning is, a lot of his battles he won by such radically different combat warfares. And one of his techniques was he was always leading with his fellow cavalry cohorts on the right hand side. That was always his position. And how he conquered Tyr, because Tyr had never been conquered before, where he basically had his men shielded, and he filled in and built a causeway in between the land and the city, and was able to conquer Tyr that way. And now he took Callisthenes, who was Aristotle's nephew. He was with Alexander on journeys. throughout all the conquering. But sometime when they got around India, they had a falling out over various disagreements, and well, Calisentes died. As Nerdalliun mentioned, there was a lot of people dying for strange reasons during that time period.
Yeah, I think Rogério mentioned that. Yeah, Catacentes, or whatever his name was, died of a fever, mysterious fever.
Well, no, that was Alexander who mysteriously died of the fever in
Alexander.
Babylon.
It could have been septicemia.
I've heard septicemia. I've heard Guillain-Barré. I've heard Hellsbore poison. I've heard malaria.
Yeah.
My personal bet is it was probably Ptolemy that did him in.
And this is one death, Alexander's death, at such a young age and suddenly, that if the man had a long life, history would be completely different. The geopolitical map, as I imagine nowadays, having Alexander not died this death, it would be an astoundingly, unimaginingly, ineffably different. I believe that's kind of like this is the raw material for the alternate history geeks par excellence. And I think no one exploited this in storytelling ever, at least as far as I know.
No, I know that. Oh, go ahead, Nerdalliun.
I was gonna say one of the interesting things he did was, and I know this because Graham wrote notes about this, so credit to Graham, was to encourage the respect and honoring of local customs and traditions, and to try to integrate them into the Greek way of life. So not imposing a Greek way of life on subjects, and also keeping local rulers who weren't rebellious or who were cooperative in their positions, and integrating him into part of his empire. And so, just to relate on that, so to relate to two things, I think the point Graham made in his write-up about him is that's an interesting, I guess, approach to political philosophy, and together with his discouraging of his soldiers to loot and pillage and rape, that was a contribution to a different way of thinking about conquering. It can be somewhat philosophical, but he enacted it in practice, so didn't necessarily write about it, but those were new ideas contributed by him. And then in terms of the alternate history, if he had been more long-living and the empire had some time under his rule to integrate, there may have been a more tight mingling of Greek culture with Persian culture and Indian culture, which may have had interesting downstream effects. It's also not clear what effects it would have had if he'd turned west further and conquered more of Europe. So yeah, I think probably the tighter integration of Persian and Indian culture with Greek culture earlier in history would have had, like, I don't know, untold effects, but probably profound effects.
Yeah. And one thing, your reference to how he treats local customs and cultures, it reminds me of the later practices of the Romans as well. And I'm not sure if they learned or drew from Aristotle, Alexander rather. But it's interesting that there is some similarities there.
Oh no, definitely. Julius Caesar very much read out of Alexander's book with that idea. If you go up to the gates of the city and you say, "I'm in charge now. Do you have a problem with that?" And if they say no and they pay you tribute, you just leave them in charge. So much easier to save your army and everything for taking out those people who only disagree with you. Much more resource friendly. No, Alexander, yeah, he definitely took out that whole raping and pillaging, and his next specific plans, which is probably the reason why he died so suddenly, was he was planning to basically, he was playing Risk. He was going to consolidate his wins and fully conquer Arabia, which is something that never been done. It's like because the current Saudi Arabian government is entirely native, so that's an area that's never technically been conquered. And that's where Alexander was going first, and then after that, he was probably going to end up going west. And it'd be interesting to see what Alexander, you would have had basically three powers in play. You would have had the overwhelming Alexander, you would have had the Roman Republic, and you would have had Carthage going at that point in time. Be interesting to see how that would have all played out at that, as well. Especially since both of them were fighting over some of the Greek colonies on Sicily. But Alexander was definitely a syncretizer, where he definitely would have brought together, the Indian, the Persian, the Greek. Don't forget the Egyptian culture as well. And what would have happened, Lord only knows, but it would have been profoundly different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. We're talking about just one guy, one life, and it's like the quantum effect amplification to classical physics kind of thing. The particle can be turned up or turned down, and whether it's turned up or turned down, the cat either lives or is dead. And in this case, there is either a kind of Eurasian mega empire, or there is just a fragment of Ptolemaic, Bactrian, Seleucid, and Greek kingdoms with a lot of infighting and a lot of aristocrats killing each other, backstabbing. The outcomes are only only looking at the geopolitical level are massive. And if we look at the philosophical, traditional, religious, and etc. Ramifications, these would be also quite remarkable as well.
Yeah, I was going to say a couple of more points on. Go ahead, Nerdalliun.
I was going to ask if we missed a couple of more points, so if you have a couple of more points, that's good.
Yeah, no, I was going to. A couple of more points I was going to put was the theft of Bucephalus, where one time his horse had gotten stolen, and instead of he threatened to clear cut the country instead of in retaliation, and they basically returned the horse and begged for forgiveness. Another one that I always think is interesting is Alexander was the only person who ever actually conquered Afghanistan. And he did it the old-fashioned way, where he was in a siege, and he resolved the siege by marrying the daughter of the king.
Roxana was her name.
Exactly, right? Roxana, exactly. Again, he got a hot redhead. I guess he figured, I get to marry a hot redhead, end the siege, no more death, conquer the kingdom, good deal.
Yeah, it's a win-win. And that's pretty much the only guy, the only party who ever took Afghanistan up until the USA, but well, we won't talk about how it ended.
Yeah. Alexander had a little more love involved in his conquering than the U.S. did. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
They made some numbers about that.
They had much fancier toys than Alexander did.
Yeah, exactly. But there were kind of innovations or rather high technology involving weaponry in both cases. The Um, the Macedonians with their very long spears. Who would have thought about this? Just make longer spears and train the troops to form a concerted, organized row of shields, and just just prickle the assaulting soldiers or horsemen or whatnot. It really worked wonders. But they also innovated a lot, like when we talk about the siege of Tyre. They who would have thought about constructing a mole to the islands and then take the island, and then basically this contributed to them knocking off the Persian fleet being able to operate in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
of the aspects about the failings that was truly frightening for a lot of competing armies was the idea that if they turned and ran and you sent your cavalry after them to mow them down, they could stop on a dime, have those shields and those spears pointed straight at those horses charging into them. And that was just disaster if that happened to you. So it was just a total game changer.
And let's not forget the number of rows that are supposedly involved in the phalanx. They had a lot of inbuilt redundancy. If the guys in the front start dying, they have a whole bunch of guys behind to start to lower their spears and do some damage. I think sometimes they even used 60 men deep rows.
Yeah, I think the strategy was when the guys in front start dying, the ones behind step up.
Yeah. Also, from the documentary on Alexander, I'll also link it in the video description after the stream. It's a really good one on YouTube. And they mentioned when they started their first battle after invading the Persian Empire, that rather it's the battle of let's see, Granicus, the Battle of Granicus. There were Greek mercenaries on the Persian side, and the mercenaries were at the back because the Persians didn't trust them 100%. After the Macedonian army mowed down the Persian army, only the mercenaries remained. What treatment did they give to the mercenaries? They slaughtered them all until the last man. Alexander ordered them to give them no pardon, no forgiveness. They were on the wrong side of history in Alexander's estimation.
Another aspect is you couldn't trust them not to betray you. You couldn't trust them not to be spies or something as well. And you also give an example of your troops is the Greeks don't betray other Greeks.
Yeah. And often people online even wonder, was he really putting himself in danger like that? Was he really leading from the front? Some people are justifyingly skeptic about that, especially because nowadays you hardly see any people declaring war that also go and lead from the front. This is in stark contrast with what happens today. We have a guy from the east invading another country, and that guy, rather than leading from the front, hides.
Yeah, I think if we required the leader of the country to be first in line, leading the charge, I think we'd have less wars. Peg.
I think it was also a point made by Kant.
Yeah. No, things changed. It's slightly off topic, but we are talking about war, I guess. In the First World War, I think, if I remember correctly from Dan Collins' Hardcore History, or Blueprint from Armageddon, the French army still had policies where it was considered bad for morale for the officers to take cover. So, so they were instructed to stand upright on the battlefield, and they were still doing column, at least in the early parts of World War One, still marching in columns the way Napoleon would march his troops in columns. And when you're facing up against very accurate rifle fire and machine gun fire, not a good idea to stand up straight in columns on the receiving end of that. So that policy changed. So you, like the officers in front, dug trenches and got behind some cover. behind some cover. Really, for me, I don't have that many patriotic feelings towards South Africa, but something that does inspire just a little inkling of patriotism was early parts of World War One. Apparently, the British were better prepared than some of the other countries because they'd recently fought the Boer Wars against my ancestors, and my ancestors were way unprepared and unequipped and undermanned to fight against the British Empire, like the biggest empire in the world then. They were a bunch of farmers and hunters, and they turned to tactics to give them an advantage. So they had like teenage boys hiding behind rocks and taking pot shots at British who were standing in columns, and just mowing down like much larger armies because they were savvy enough to hide behind cover and take aimed shots at people rather than just stand in a line and roughly shoot in a general direction. And the British figured, oh, okay, we have rifles now, not muskets. They work a little different. It really pays to give your soldiers 20 bullets a week and have them shoot at targets on a range so that your infantrymen have some aim. And so I think the British infantry riflemen were shooting faster and more accurately than most people, and they had the savvy to take cover, which a lot of the other armies early in World War One did not have the savvy to do, and partly because they learned to do that fighting against my ancestors.
So your ancestors taught them and prepared them for World War One.
Yeah.
But also, with guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly guerrilla warfare. Like, I've been told many times that my ancestors are the inventors of guerrilla warfare, but like I've done some searches and there are elements of guerrilla tactics going back way further back in history than just my ancestors. But especially with rifles, like, you know, taking cover and taking aimed fire was a new kind of thing, which seems a very obvious thing to do.
Yes.
But the most successful rifleman was I think a Canadian, but an indigenous Canadian, Pega Magabu, I think, something like that. But also a trained hunter, so he had a feeling for taking cover and moving slowly and like avoiding being seen and taking well-timed, well-aimed shots. And he had the highest kill count in all of World War One, and he would pull off feats that other people would think completely impossible. He would make it into enemy trenches, and he would steal stuff from them alone and take it back to his trench. A lot of other people died trying to cross no man's land, but you know, so hunting savvy really pays off when people are fighting with rifles. Sorry,
and
that was way off topic.
I was going to say sort of a World War One version of Punked.
Of Punked?
Yeah, you sneak in behind the lines and just steal something from the other side.
Oh yeah,
it's just a practical joke on them.
Yeah. But this touches upon the philosophical aspects of war doctrine, actually. People were kind of presuming that war had a kind of an etiquette in the times of the French Revolution, the Napoleon Wars, the war of the war for independence of the United States, the war between North and South, at least from the documentaries I've seen, the pictures and whatnot. For the most part, the armies seem to confront each other in rows, and they are all kind of playing this game as if it were, and no one is going against the etiquette of actually hiding behind cover or being sneaky, no one is being sneaky. Everyone is out in the field, out in the open. No sneakiness involved. All being very British about their etiquette, almost too much. And it's like the philosophy of war doctrine was being absurd. And when someone breaks the mold, so to speak, or thinks outside of the box, and figures out the absurdity of what's going on, they get the upper hand very, very easily, while everyone is entertained with these niceties of war or war etiquette, which now in retrospect seem quite ridiculous. Now every pretty much every war we see has these war tactics of cover and subterfuge, and using information also as a weapon, maybe with much more emphasis now more than ever. So yeah, this is war philosophy.
Yeah, no, I'd never heard the Boer War presented as an idea that was basically a warm-up war for the British for World War One. They could sort of, just sort of warm up on that one. And again, I always think of Patton, where it's again, some of his speeches where it's no dumbass ever won a war by dying for their country. You win the war by making the other dumbass die for his country.
Yeah, that's a cool quote.
Yeah. Censored a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, sanitized. You sanitized it. Yeah. I really like this illustration. It has the guys with the Phrygian caps, the Corinthian helmets, all lined up. Forest of spears. I think that while we in the West name Alexander the Great, I think at least at the time they were naming him Alexander the Terrible, the Persians.
Yeah.
What is order for the the spider is chaos for the fly, as the Adam's Family creator says.
Yeah. All right. Any more notes about Alexander and his philosophy, or shall we call that a day?
No more notes on my part.
I was going to say he had a short life, and that's I think all we have for him on philosophy. When you go military history, he can go on a while longer, but I think we're done philosophically. Tag.
Yeah.
Yeah, the more contemplative type of philosopher tend to live longer. This guy, he really put into practice his thinking. Plato almost died when he went to Syracuse to change the guy. So Plato also had his bouts of the active philosophical life, but Alexander really went hardcore on the active life.
Yeah. Well, so I think that draws to a close our study of classical Greece, or the classical Greek section of Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy without any gaps. I'd like to take a moment to thank you guys. It's been really interesting, and it's always very interesting conversations, and having you around and knowing that I kind of need to prepare for these streams helps me keep motivated to get through the material, and having someone to discuss with it also motivating, just that someone else also cares about it. Just having someone else who cares about the material is also motivating, and then hearing your perspectives on it and hearing your takes on it, and learning from your contextual knowledge of other sources and stuff really helps me enrich the material. So I really appreciate you guys doing this with me. We're not getting famous doing this anytime soon, but it feels very rich and rewarding anyway. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for caring, Nerdalliun and Graham. it has been so far really rewarding and enriching. Even if the only reward is the conversations between us and the effort in preparing these sessions and what goes on during the sessions. Yeah, it's for sure this is being an enriching project.
No, I agree. It's again, they're missing out on that. At least we're recording it so they can enjoy us later. Hey,
Yeah, shout out to the people that are curious about philosophy, that they have the burning desire to know more, to be a bit knowledgeable today than yesterday. Um, uh, live long and prosper, you guys. You are the people that are keeping things running.
Made me think of a variant of the philosophical question: if a tree falls, but there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Like, if a show is performed, but no one's watching, is there an audience? Anyway. All right, shall we end it on that note then, and come back next time with some ancient Indian philosophy that I'm really excited about getting through. Really keen to learn. Vaguely familiar that there's a lot more diversity in that tradition and in that history than we typically get exposed to in the West, or as I like to, where I'm sitting is the South, really. So I'm keen to be informed about more of that diversity and see how the Jains differed from the Buddhists, and how different Buddhists had their quabbles and debates among themselves, and how both the Jains and the Buddhists thought Vedanta was nonsense, or the Vedas was just old wives' tales. And,
yeah, what do you mean? All is Brahman. All is Brahman.
Yeah, so looking forward to that, and probably will get triggered a couple of times, but that's how it goes. That's how it goes studying philosophy.
But if you're triggered, you're learning. Go ahead.
I said I'm interested in seeing how they differentiate between the philosophy and the religion, because the Greeks had a very hard line that they drew, and I'm not sure exactly where in India where they divide the big line. That seems a little more blurry to me. But I'm looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, we'll find out soon enough. I think Peterson covers that in some of the earlier episodes. So next week we'll tune in back with that.
Stay tuned, non-existent audience.
We're doing the Aristotle thing now. That's a very good point, Graham, but we're not going to discuss that today. So we'll come back next time. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.